Good morning, everyone. Today we have the distinct pleasure of introducing Marti J. Steussy, who is the MacAllister-Petticrew Professor of Biblical Interpretation at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. She is the author, for our purposes in particular, of David, Biblical Portraits in Power, or of Power rather. But I'm also intrigued by the fact that you're also the author of 2 science fiction books, which is an unusual thing for someone in biblical studies, I would think. Although, when you think about it, there could very well be some links to that. So we're so glad that you're with us today, and your topic is going to be one that I think is something that we really want to highlight, and that is you're going to be talking in particular about Michal, who is David's wife and daughter of Saul with a question mark. So that sounds interesting. And I believe you said the last time we heard you when you were here with Professor Alter that you are maybe also going to be talking about maybe some of the other women in the book of Samuel, or are we just focusing on Michal today?
It will be mostly Michal.
Okay, good. Well, with no further ado, we're looking forward to your presentation. Let's welcome Professor Marti Steussy.
Thank you. Thank you. The link between writing science fiction and being a Hebrew Bible scholar, and also being absolutely fascinated by animals, which I am, is that I'm so intrigued by how it is that different minds communicate with each other. And in the case of the Hebrew Bible, it's a culture long ago and far away, and we're doing our best. Even just to understand the language, let alone where people are coming from and what they're thinking. So I tell you that at the beginning because it clues you in that I'm interested in helping us hear this particular bit of biblical literature from a different angle than the assumption that it is just our own familiar religious world that we're hearing about. So to say a little bit more about where I'm coming from, I mentioned last time when I listened in on Professor Alter's lecture that I absolutely adore his work and that he's been an inspiration for my career. And that is particularly at the point of interpreting the biblical books that we have. And he came at just the right point in the 20th century when the business of trying to break the books apart into sources had sort of been beaten into the ground. And it was really refreshing to have somebody say, why don't we ask how it looks in the final thing we got, rather than in some hypothesized earlier versions. So I'm going to deal with the text we've got. And one of the things I want to be clear on is, in my mind, that is not the same as getting at a historical David. Even if some of this stuff that we're going to be talking about comes to us from people who lived through it or are at least in the next generation after it and still know the places and the situations and all the gossip, we know that an eyewitness in all good faith trying to tell it just the way it was will not give exactly the story of what happened. Because our memories are constantly changing things. And furthermore, we don't know that the biblical storytellers were even trying to do history as it exactly happened, rather than to spin a good yarn. I also just now used the phrase storytellers. I am less confident than Professor Alter that we're hearing a unified voice in the books of Samuel. To me, especially in 1 Samuel, but also at points in 2 Samuel, the effect we've got is kind of like the Japanese story Rashomon, where a single event is told several times and the accounts of it from different people don't match up. Even more sometimes it reminds me of being at a family reunion, where people are saying, oh man, do you remember old grandfather David? You know, he was such a power-hungry problematic old guy, and somebody else will say, no, he was really generous and really brave. He was one of the nicest people I ever met. And we're used to hearing that at family gatherings, that different people have different experiences and different takes. And it'll even get to the point, well, I remember the first time she met the family. Oh, no, that's not how I remember it. So in the books of Samuel, you do get those different things. And my commitment to interpreting the final form doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to mash all the voices together and try and get them to say the same thing. If they're giving us different takes on things, I want to honor that. In terms of what that means for understanding the Bible as scripture, I'd like to recommend James A. Sanders' little book. It's an easy read, Canon and Community, which is about honoring the Bible as scripture, and yet saying the whole reason they were talking about those different sources is that you can still hear there are different voices in there. And if you can still hear them in the Bible we've got now, then they're part of that Bible. That book and everything else that I think I'm going to mention this afternoon, I have on a one-page bibliography that I sent to Father Mark, and you are welcome to it. I also recommended on there Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Bible. There's a shorter volume called, I think it's called The David Story, but it's on the bibliography that covers just the part that's about David. And I also recommend the translation by Everett Fox in the Shochan Bible series. And again, you can get a larger volume that covers Joshua through 2 Kings, or he published earlier the books of Samuel in a smaller volume called Give Us a King. So those are really fun translations, and I recommend them to you. So as I come at interpreting the final form of the books of Samuel we have, another thing I don't want to assume before we start is that we already know what they're going to teach. In fact, I don't want to assume that they are out to teach anything. And most of the people who write about the Bible are either professors or preachers, and in both cases, they are people who make their living teaching. And maybe they project that agenda onto the Bible a little bit more than they should. I seriously doubt that the books of Samuel were written as religious teaching. The concept of Bible, if these books are from the kinds of dates I think they're from, hadn't been invented when they were written. So the writers wouldn't have known that what they were writing was going to become a Bible because they didn't know what Bible was. Furthermore, if these books are from, and they got polished at a late date, but if the bulk of them is from the kinds of early dates that I think, it was before what scholars of religion call the axial age. And religions the world over before the axial age, and the axial age is somewhere around the 400s BCE, plus or minus a century or two, depending on where you're talking about. But before the axial age, people sort of thought of religion in terms of there are spirit powers in the world. And what you want to do is live a long time and be successful and be honored in your community. And so you want to avoid the attention of spirit powers that are going to do you harm. And you want to encourage the attention of spirit powers that can help you. And that's a little bit different than thinking in terms of religion as a moral system and thinking about religion as a system of values that could possibly challenge the things that society is asking to do. It's a little bit different than the concept that there might be something more important in life than being rich and successful in the community. It involves thinking about at what point might faith call us to challenge the values of the people around us. Those are kinds of questions that tend not to come up in pre-axial religion, which is much more about, I want to be successful. Can God or the gods help me? So I think in the books of Samuel, we kind of have a pre-axial view of God. When it says God loved David, because we're used to when it says God loved David, I think what that means is, look at what a success David was. He must have had the backing of the spirit powers. Now, it's interesting because Christians say that God loves sinners and that we're all sinners. And Christians worship a Messiah who was crucified, and much of the time we claim to be clear that because life goes badly for somebody doesn't mean that they deserved it. You can't go backwards from misfortune happening to somebody to them being a sinner. And yet when we interpret biblical books, it's amazing how we want the people who succeed to have deserved it. And if people don't succeed, we need to make villains out of them so that we don't have to feel bad about what happened to them. You're going to hear in this talk I give today that I have very strong feelings about how that has worked out with David and Saul. David succeeds, so we make a hero out of him and a saint. Things go badly for Saul, and so we desperately search for reasons in the story to put Saul down and say that he deserved it. And the problem is there's a whole bunch of things that both Saul and David do that we condemn Saul for and praise David for. We have a double standard because we're trying to make a morality story out of it. If we could recognize that it's not a story where people necessarily get what they deserve for their virtue, we might have an easier time with it. Okay, that's probably enough background. Let's go talk about Michal. And I do want to start by talking about her father, Saul. When David is anointed, there is a comment about God looks upon the heart and not merely upon the outward appearance. And that has led people to say that God looked into David's heart, but Saul's heart was bad. And that David was chosen by God, but Saul was chosen by the people. I just want to say it is absolutely and unmistakably clear in the first book of Samuel that Saul is chosen by God. God has, according to the story, and again, I don't know what God really said, but I know what the story says God said. God said to Samuel, tomorrow I'm going to send you the guy who's going to rescue Israel. And the next day, Saul shows up at Samuel's door and God taps Samuel on the shoulder and said, this one, this is the one who's going to be the hero that's going to rescue my people. Anoint him. It was God who chose Saul. But you see, Samuel was the leader of the people until Saul came along. And Samuel is not very happy about having to have a king. So Saul is working against the prophet who was the leader before him, because the prophet has skin in the game. He's not just a neutral, uninvolved spokesperson for God. He wanted his sons to follow him as rulers of Israel, but there was a problem because they were corrupt and took bribes. David's going to have some corrupt sons too, but he doesn't lose his job over it. So a couple of things happen. I particularly want to point out the exchange in 1 Samuel 13. Saul is out getting ready to fight the Philistines, and Saul is asked to do the job of a king, but he doesn't quite have the powers of a king. We never hear about him exacting taxes. He doesn't have a palace. He apparently doesn't have a big bureaucracy, and he apparently does not have the power to conscript fighters. So he's got a volunteer army. And Samuel has said, wait 7 days, and then I'll come and offer the sacrifices, and then you can go do the battle. So Saul's sitting there with his volunteer army for 7 days, and it says he waited the time appointed by Samuel. He waited for the time appointed by Samuel. And the whole time his volunteer army is looking at those Philistines over on the other hill. Those Philistines are a whole lot of them, and they've got really good armor and really good weapons. And each day, some more of Saul's volunteer fighters say, we really need to get home and take care of our fields. So his army is slipping away. He has waited the number of days that Samuel said. He figures he needs to go into battle, and he absolutely doesn't want to do it without proper sacrifices having been offered, so he makes the sacrifices. And the instant that Saul makes the sacrifices, boom, there's Samuel saying, "How dare you disobey the commandment of the Lord?" Well, it says that Samuel was the one who hadn't followed the plan. He didn't come during the 7 days that Saul waited. And that's been recognized for a long time. So some people say, well, really, what Saul disobeyed was a commandment that kings are not allowed to make sacrifices. Only prophets and priests can do that. I want you to remember that. Because later we're going to come up against the question of what Saul's daughter might think of a king who offers sacrifices. Then in a later chapter, the last encounter between Saul and Samuel during Samuel's lifetime, and there is a seance later where Samuel's ghost meets Saul, but this is their last encounter in Samuel's life. Samuel has been protecting David, who is on the run from Saul. Saul has sent messengers to arrest David. Samuel sort of does his prophet power thing, and the messengers fall down on the ground in a religious frenzy. It's a variant of the word for prophesying. Eventually, Saul goes himself, and it says he too stripped off his clothes, and he too fell into this is Saul, and Saul too fell into a frenzy before Samuel. He lay naked all that day and all that night. Therefore it is said, is Saul also among the prophets? And the reason I'm pointing this out is that later we're going to come up against the question of what Saul's daughter might think of somebody who is writhing in a religious frenzy with not very many clothes on. And whether she might have reason to think that that's not how a king should act, given the scorn expressed for Saul those times that a spirit comes upon him and he does this frenzied prophesying. Okay, I'm going to share a screen now so that you can see exactly the verse that I'm looking at. So in the chapter after that story about the sacrificing, we get this summary of Saul's career and his family. And what's interesting is it sounds like the summaries we get after each of the careers of the judges in the books of Judges. That's kind of fitting because in some ways I said Saul is asked to do the job of a king without the powers of a king. So in some ways Saul is really the last judge rather than the first king. But it says, when Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all, and it could be either his or its enemies on every side, in other words, against Israel's enemies, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he routed them. He did valiantly and struck down the Amalekites and rescued Israel out of the hands of those who plundered him. This is a voice who thinks that Saul did a good job. Can you hear that? Then it goes on to the genealogy stuff, sort of looking forward to the next generation. It gives the names of Saul's sons, and then it says, and the names of his 2 daughters were these. And at this point, you should be sitting up straight and perking your ears, because you may have noticed that genealogies in the Bible usually don't list daughters. And since biblical storytellers don't give us information without a reason, as a general rule, if it's going to name daughters, that means these are going to be players in the story to come. So the names of his two daughters were these. I've underlined them and I want you to remember them. The firstborn was Merab. And the name of the younger, Michal. And then we got another woman's name that I'd also like you to remember. The name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam. And just for fun, the name of the commander of his army was Abner. The name Abner means my father is Ner. So no surprise that Abner was the son of Ner. Ner was Saul's uncle. So there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong or valiant warrior, he took him into his service. And you can read this last line at the bottom two ways. On the one hand, it's foreshadowing that when the strong and valiant warrior David shows up, Saul will take him into his service, right? But also, we're later going to hear that when David strikes out on his own from Saul, worthless fellows gathered around him. And that contrast between Saul having strong and valiant warriors and David being surrounded by worthless fellows doesn't work quite as much in David's favor. So one of the things I said, I'm going to resist reading these stories in terms of thinking I know in advance what the lesson is. All through, we're going to find these ambiguities. There's more than one way you can read what's being hinted at. This is a foreshadowing David being a strong and valiant warrior, and on the other hand, it's kind of a slam against the kind of guys who followed David versus the kind of guys who followed Saul. Okay, Robert Alter has taught us that we should always pay attention to the, actually, I'm going to unshare the screen for a minute and tell you something else first. We should always pay attention to the first words that a Bible character says. So David's first words come in the Goliath story in 1 Samuel 17. Now there are two stories about how David and Saul met. Because previous to this, we have heard that David is an accomplished young soldier, courtier, and musician, just the kind of guy you would want to have in your court service, and so Saul brings him to court. David is not a rustic little shepherd boy in that account. In this account, which follows it, he is showing up at the battlefield to bring supplies to his older brothers. Now, the fact that his older brothers are in the army says it's a reasonably wealthy family, since they have to supply their own armor and weapons, and metal gear is very difficult to come by at this particular point in Israel's history. Not only that, but David's father has sent him with loads of food and gifts for his brother's commanders, bribes in effect, to be sure that the brothers will be treated well. And that too suggests that this may not be just a hardscrabble farm family, even though we all would love for David to be an underdog and start out as the little guy. And in fact, the whole Goliath story plays into that. Anyway, David arrives at the battlefield and the soldiers are staring at Goliath. Remember, I told you this is a volunteer army, and here's this huge human tank. And they are saying, "Wow, have you seen this man who's come up? Oh, he's come up to defy Israel. The king will greatly enrich anyone who kills him, and the king will give that man his daughter." At which point little David breaks in and says, if he is little David, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine?" David, in his first words, is interested in what's in this for me. what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine? Those are David's first words in the Bible. Okay, now, David does kill the Philistine, of course, and the king's eldest, the king says to David, here's my oldest daughter, marry her. And David said, oh, who am I and who am my family in Israel that I should marry the king's daughter? When Saul gets selected by Lot to be king and hides, we all say, oh, this is terrible. He has no self-confidence. We can see already he's going to be a rotten king. But when David says, oh, who am I that I should be king? We say, isn't that wonderful? He's so humble. We can see that he's just the right stuff to be king. That's the double standard at play again. When Saul pulls back, we take it as a bad thing when David pulls. So David has said, in effect, no. And so Saul marries off Merab to somebody else, whose name, by the way, is Adriel. We'll meet him again, too. But Saul has another daughter. Now, I'll tell you that there's a gazillion shout-outs between Genesis and the stories in the books of Samuel. And the character in Genesis that David is most like is Jacob, who is an enterprising young fellow, very clever, whose dealings are sometimes on the shady side, but he always comes out smelling like a rose. God lets Jacob get away with it. And you will recall that Jacob has two wives. There is an older daughter and there is a younger one. The younger one is Rachel, and Rachel is a lot like Michal. There are lots of threads connecting those two characters. So I'm going to go back to sharing the screen, and we're going to look at a glimpse into two hearts, Michal's heart and David's heart. In 1 Samuel 18, so this is the one following the Goliath story, Saul's daughter Michal loved David. That's a striking statement. It has been alleged that it is the only place in the Hebrew Bible where a woman is said to love a man. I'm a little hesitant about that because I think unmistakably the girl in the Song of Songs is a lover. She ought to be included as a woman who loves a man if we're talking about the Hebrew Bible. But in the prose narratives, this statement really stands out. Saul's daughter Michal loved David. And the fact that it's so rare to hear what a woman thinks about this kind of relationship signals us already that this particular woman has a mind of her own and a sense of agency. She's noisy enough about how she feels about David that Saul hears about it. And the thing pleased him. Now, here we see Saul looking not quite so good. It pleases him because he figures, that the missing verses here go on to say, he figures that if Michal loves David, he can use that to maneuver David into going out into the battlefield where the Philistines will kill him. Professor Alter reminded us 2 weeks ago that that is basically how David will later kill Bathsheba's husband. Send him out into the battlefield and let the foreign enemy take care of him. I would point out that it is also how David gets rid of Saul. Saul goes out to battle against the Philistines, for whom David is working, and David arranges not to be there. And leaves Saul to be killed by the Philistines. So anyway, David initially does his, oh, who am I, act again. And they report it to Saul, and Saul says, tell him, he doesn't need a big bride price. Just bring me 100 Philistine foreskins. Now, the trick here is that almost all the peoples round about, the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, even the Egyptians, circumcise just as the Israelites do. That doesn't differentiate them from most of their neighbors. But the Philistines are from a different part of the world where that's not the custom. So if he brings foreskins, they must have come from Philistines because nobody else has them, is the logic of this. And I will also mention these foreskins get talked about in 3 places. And one of the places it says 200, but it's at least 100. So the servants go to David and they say, all you need is 100 Philistine foreskins and you can marry the king's daughter. Now, I want you to watch carefully the phrasing in this second verse here, verse 26. When Saul's servants told David these words, David was well pleased to be the king's son-in-law. And the exact way that this is phrased signals there's going to be trouble. Michal loved David. Those are personal names. That is a particular woman loving a particular man. But what pleases David is not being Michal's husband or even Saul's son-in-law, but the king's son-in-law. David has got his eye not on the woman that wants to marry him, but on the political implications of the marriage. And here you need to know that in the ancient world, to be associated with a king's women is to lay claim to a place of power in the court. Treaties between kings were often sealed by one king giving the other a daughter to marry. Also, sometimes, and we will see this coming up later today, to approach a king's wife or concubine is to lay claim to that king's power. That's why down the line in 2 Samuel, Absalom will pitch a tent on the roof in order that he can publicly approach the 12 concubines that David has left behind. That is because it is an understood public way of saying, I'm taking my father's kingdom by approaching his women. And I have on the bibliography an article entitled The Political Import of David's Marriages that goes into all that stuff. But here, David was pleased. This is our first glimpse into what David thinks. Well pleased to be the king's son-in-law. Well, we'll see how this one turns out. He does marry Michal, but things fall apart pretty fast. We're only moving ahead 1 chapter here, from 18 to 19. As you know, the story is that Saul is jealous of David. God sends an evil spirit. It's interesting. This is reported as Saul's response to a spirit sent by God upon him, on Saul, and he tries to throw his spear at David, and he's mad enough that he sends messengers to David's house, planning on killing him. And David's wife, Michal, she's named here as David's wife because we're going to see this is her loyalties are to David now. David's wife, Michal, told him, if you don't save your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. Remember I said she's somebody with an opinion and agency? She is the one saying to David, you better get out of here or you're going to be dead. Then we see her letting him down through the window. And notice that window, because the woman at a window is a really famous ancient Near Eastern meme. It comes up in stories, it comes up in poetry, it comes up in artwork that you find archaeologically, the image of a woman at a window. So It comes up a number of times in the Hebrew Bible, and this is one of them. But here, what's going on at the window is not the woman looking longingly out, waiting for her soldier husband to return, but the woman letting her soldier husband down out the window so he can escape. So Michal let David down through the window. He fled away and escaped. She took a teraphim. We're not sure exactly what a teraphim was, but it sounds like some kind of household religious object that would be roughly human in shape and size. And when I said there are shout outs between Genesis and Samuel, Rachel, when Jacob is on the run from Laban, takes her family's teraphim with her. Here, by the way, is another place where people say, what was wrong with this daughter of Saul that she had teraphim in the household? When you could equally well say, and so why was it that David had teraphim in his household? But somehow commentators always blame her and not David for the fact. What she does with them is take this object and put it in the bed with a wig of curly goat's hair and covering it with bedclothes. And when Saul's messengers come, Michal says, oh, he's sick. Saul sent the message. Saul says to the messenger, you go look for yourselves. But if he's too sick to get out of bed, then bring him to me in bed. I'm going to kill him. And when the messengers come in, they discover that that's not David, that's the teraphim that's in the bed. And Saul is furious and says to Michal, why did you deceive me like this and let my enemy go? And she says, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? This doesn't fit with the account that we got up at the top of the slide about what happened. It's a different kind of tone. One of the things you need to remember is that biblical characters can lie. That's why a glimpse from the narrator into their heart is more trustworthy than just listening to what they say, because what they say may or may not be what they really feel. I think that's probably what's happened. She's already told the messengers that David is sick, which is not true. And of course, this husband that she loved so much is gone. He's not around to protect her. She is left behind at the mercy of her father. And we know at this point, her father is kind of a dangerous guy. He was angry enough to kill her husband, and he might be angry enough to kill her for letting the husband get away. So I think what's happening is that she's getting herself off the hook by blaming David. The alternative is to imagine a scene in which both things happen, in which she says, you got to get away tonight or you'll be dead, but he also threatens her. The story doesn't absolutely resolve that question for us. So David gets away, and he starts accumulating other wives. We hear at the end of 1 Samuel 25, most of this chapter, by the way, is about Abigail. That Abigail went after the messengers of David and became his wife. Abigail is beautiful, rich, and has large estates, and she's also a consummate orator. She knows how to flatter David. An interesting fact is that there are only a tiny handful of references to any woman named Abigail in Scripture, and all the other references are to David's sister. And this was an era when kings were sometimes known to marry their sisters. Later in 2 Samuel, David's daughter Tamar will say to her brother, if you'd asked the king to give me to you as a wife, he would have done it. But that's it could be that they are different Abigails. We don't know. Then in the next verse, we hear David also married Ahinoam of Jezreel. both of them became his wives. There are only 2 mentions of a woman named Ahinoam in the Hebrew Bible, and we already saw the other one. What was the name of Saul's wife? Ahinoam. If this is the same Ahinoam, and we do not know for sure that it is, but if it is, it would explain why, right after David's getaway, Saul is yelling at Jonathan about a perverse, rebellious woman and your mother's nakedness. That anger and that reference to Jonathan's mother would be quite explicable if, in fact, when David left, Ahinoam had gone with him. The other possibly relevant point is that later down the line, when the prophet Nathan is confronting David about Bathsheba, Nathan says, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel. I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom." So it could be that the Ahinoams are the same woman. If it is, the logic of the move from verse 43 to 44 is completely evident. David married Ahinoam of Jezreel. Well, if that was Saul's wife, we can see why Saul would take revenge by taking Michal, David's wife, and whom David has abandoned, to be sure, and giving her to Palti, son of Laish. Can you see the logic there? The verses I'm quoting in my slides are all from the NRSV, and if I've changed anything, I've left you a note about it. I say here I've modified it because in the NRSV, it says Saul had given. So it shifts the temporal sequence so that first Saul gave Michal to Palti, and then David marries Ahinoam and Abigail. But there's nothing in the Hebrew grammar to substantiate that change in tense in the NRSV. The most natural way to read it would be David married Ahinoam and Saul gave Michal, as if that were the order that things happened in. Okay, after this, Saul dies on the battlefield. All Saul's sons except one die on the battlefield. And David comes into his own. But that one surviving son of Saul is holed up in a town with Saul's general Abner. And you know, when the general's still around, you've still got a chance to fight back and keep the kingdom. But what we hear in 2 Samuel 3, we're back to women. We're back to the king's women. Saul, who is now dead, had a concubine named Rizpah. And we will meet Rizpah once more before the afternoon is over. And Ishbaal, that Saul's surviving son, said to Abner, "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" Well, Ishbaal is reacting to this not as a widowed concubine finding somebody else she can join her life to, but as a move on Abner's part to claim the kingdom. He's angry. And Abner gets angry at being chided about it. He sends messengers to David saying, "To whom does the land belong? Make your covenant with me and I'll bring all Israel over to you." David's response, again, the principle of a king's women representing a claim to the kingship. "This is only going to happen unless you bring Saul's daughter Michal. Interestingly, he doesn't say in this verse, my one Michal, but Saul's daughter Michal, when you come to see me. And then here we get a little bit of a conflicted story, because he's told the general he wants Michal. Then he sends messengers to the surviving son, with whom the general is on the outs, saying, give me Michal. So the surviving son sent and took her from her husband, Paltiel, the son of Laish, but her husband went with her, weeping as he walked behind her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner, the general, said to him, go back home. So he went back. I find this an absolutely heartbreaking scene. We don't know what Michal thought when Saul married her off to Paltiel, but it sure looks here as if Paltiel loved her a great deal. But she's now a political pawn. She represents a claim to the kingship, and so she's been taken away from Paltiel and given back to David. He walked behind her weeping all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, go home. This brings us up to the lectionary. This week, the lectionary will tell the beginning of David's story of moving into Jerusalem and claiming the kingship. And then next week, on the 11th, we will get the story of David bringing up the ark to Jerusalem. In that story, let me grab my copy of the text of it here. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, David is dancing in front of the ark wearing only a linen ephod. Now, there is an ephod that is worn by the priests. It's kind of a very fancy vest with lots of decorations and precious stones and embroidery and pockets to hold the sacred divining lots, the Urim and the Thummim. The linen ephod, which is what David is said to be wearing, so far as we can tell, was kind of a loincloth. It was underwear. Not a big formal gown. So our artist here is making David look a lot more dressed than the description in the text actually does. David is dancing in front of the ark, wearing a linen ephod and making a sacrifice every 6 steps that the oxen pulling the ark take. Every 6th step. We want to go back now and remember about Michal's father and engaging in ecstatic religious frenzy with not very many clothes on. And we also want to remember the controversy about whether a king is allowed to make sacrifices or only a prophet can do that. It seems to me that Saul's daughter, knowing her family's history, might well have reason to question what David is doing here. David brings the ark into Jerusalem and he sends presents. It looks for all the world like an ancient Near Eastern fertility festival. And one of the things that he sends to everybody in town is raisin cakes. Well, if you look up where raisin cakes appear elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, they are referred to in 2 of the prophetic books, Isaiah and I think it's Hosea, though I wouldn't swear to it, in association with the worship of fertility gods. The other place that raisin cakes get mentioned is in the Song of Songs. Oh, feed me with apples, sustain me with raisin cakes, for I am sick with love. So those raisin cakes are kind of a loaded symbol. And so we hear, and this part is in next week's lectionary reading, as the ark of the Lord came into the city, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before Lord, and she despised him in her heart. I hope I've given you enough of her point of view for you to understand why she might react that way. They bring in the ark, and David makes more offerings and distributes his raisin cakes to everybody. Then David returned to bless his house. Oh, this is, by the way, the woman at the window motif again. Once again, Michal is at a window. And the painter, who is J.J. Tissot in the late 1800s, I'm pretty sure that the character who represents Michal is the woman in back in white who has her face partly covered. You can see that her three maids are just taking it in. They are just fascinated with what they see out the window. She looks a little more reserved. David returned to bless his household, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, and this following scene, whether or not it really happened, just sounds painfully, painfully real. How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself. David said to Michal, it was before Lord, who chose me in place of your father and all his household, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of Lord, that I have danced before Lord. I'll make myself yet more contemptible than this. I might even be abased in my own eyes, but by the maids of whom you have spoken, by twist, twist goes the knife, by them I will be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. And the lectionary leaves off this verse. I think I'm glad that it does, because I have heard way too many preachers declare with complete confidence that this was God's punishment of Michal for refusing to recognize David's legitimacy and honor. Well, maybe what David was doing was okay, and maybe it wasn't. There are two things that explanation doesn't take into account. One of them is that this phrasing is ambiguous. It's not clear whether it is saying that Michal had no child her whole life long, or whether it is saying that she had no child from this moment until the day of her death, leaving open the possibility that she and Paltiel had had children. If she did not, but if she does not have children from this day forward, David is going to be challenged by more than one rebellion in his reign from supporters of Saul's family. If David could have a child that joined his bloodline and Saul's bloodline, that would be tremendously useful in securing the succession. Arguably, for her to have no child is as much punishment of David or more than it is of Michal herself. The other interesting thing is that it doesn't say that God withheld children from Michal. And there have been a number of commentators over the years, over the centuries, who have said David wanted nothing to do with her after this. That would be plausible too. I am embarrassed to say that it was not until I heard the papers that are published in the book telling Queen Michal's story, which is on the bibliography, that it crossed my mind there is one more possibility. And that is that Michal locked her door, and that's why she had no child from this point to the day of her death. We have seen that she is a strong-willed woman. We have just seen that she is willing to publicly confront David. We know she is somebody who in her past life has shown a lot of agency. So I would not rule out the possibility that it was because of Michal rather than because of David that there was no child. It would be nice if this were her last appearance. No, it wouldn't be nice. It would still be painful if this were her last appearance in the book of Samuel. In the Greek book of Samuel, it is. In most English translations, it is. But if you read the book of Samuel in Hebrew, there is one more story in which there's a famine, and the oracle conveniently says that it is because Saul had too much zeal for the Lord and slaughtered Gibeonites. That's a little ironic since Saul's final casting off from Samuel comes because Saul had mercy. But the Gibeonites tell David, well, what we need is for you to hand over Saul's descendants to us. So David spares Jonathan's son, who is in any case lame and therefore not qualified to be king because kings are supposed to lead their armies to battle in person. But he took the 2 sons of Rizpah, remember Rizpah, whom she bore to Saul, and, says the Hebrew, the 5 sons of Michal, daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, son of Barzillai the Maholathite. Now, the English translations change the name here to Merab. First of all, because they read the verse we just looked at as meaning that Michal had no children and therefore she couldn't have 5 sons. But as I pointed out, it could be that these are children born in her second marriage. Secondly, the name of the husband here is Merab's husband, not Michal's husband. On the other hand, they are being sacrificed because of who their mother is, not because of who their mother's husband is. And arguably, if the scribe made a mistake, it would have been more likely made with the husband's name than with the mother's name. So it could be that this is correct, and they were Michal's 5 sons from her marriage to Paltiel. If not, they are her sister's 5 sons. And therefore, if she hasn't got sons herself, the children next closest to her heart. And they are human sacrificed on the mountain before Lord. That's painful. That's just painful. There's a little bit of redemption because Rizpah, supposedly you just leave the bodies out and the wild animals and birds eat them. But Rizpah sits watch over the bodies and won't let that happen until there's such a public stink that David collects those bodies and Saul's and Jonathan's bodies and gets everybody home safely, at least to an honorable burial in their family's burial cave. So it's a little bit of honor salvaged at the end for Saul's family. There are good points of David in the books of Samuel. I especially like the fact he messes up a lot, but when he gets caught, he will at least admit it. Not everybody is big enough to do that. When Nathan confronts him, David can say, I am the man. And the other thing I like about David is he's always willing to hold the door open. He's always willing to say, it may yet be that God will relent, that there will be some salvation. That's a good point. But I think that this story is not really so much about the ordinary kinds of lessons we look for, where there's a good role model and bad role models, but rather a reminder of how complicated life is. The line between good and evil runs through human beings rather than between them. David's a mixed character, Saul's a mixed character, Michal is a mixed character, and we're left to puzzle over the fact that judgment should not be as easy as we sometimes try and make it. And the other thing that I think we might learn from these stories. Why, if David was so perfect, and if this is all about making David look good, do we see Paltiel walking behind weeping? Why would we see this heartbreaking scene at the end with the 7 descendants impaled on the mountain? Why do we see the 12 concubines locked up by David to live like living widows the rest of their lives? I think there's a reminder here in the complexity of these stories that just because God loves us doesn't mean God hates our enemies. And with that, let's do some questions and discussing. Thank you.
Questions? First of all, are there any questions from the folks in the Zoom room? And how about from here, Alicia?
I was noticing that at the beginning, when Saul first asked David to marry one of his daughters, his eldest daughter, he says, "Oh no, who am I?" But when he is asked about Michal, his statement is he thinks it's good to be the son-in-law of a king. What changed between the first time and the second time, and why was his attitude so different? Was it him that changed, or had circumstances changed?
That's a great question, and the answer is it's my fault because I clipped out some verses. He also, in connection with Michal, and I just left out these verses so the slide would be more readable, his initial response is, again, who am I? And so there are a couple rounds of negotiation with Michal where the servants come back and say, hey, David said to him, and Saul says, no, go tell him, it'll be fine. This is all he's got to do. And so it's after the second round of reassurances that David decides it seems a pretty good idea. It may also be that he learned a lesson the first time, that if you stick with the humble act too long, you might lose your chance. But, that's one of those things that we don't get told for sure. He does do some humility with Michal as well. But obviously, in the end, it turns out different.
Other questions?
Could you tell the story about the man who goes after, walks after David, throwing stones at him?
Oh, okay. I used to have that story by memory. Actually, let me find it to be sure I don't tell it wrong. There we go. Okay. So David is, and by the way, this story takes place at Bahurim. That's the same place that Paltiel got turned back. So David has Jonathan's son, who is lame, as a house prisoner in Jerusalem. I mean, he eats at the king's table, is sounds great, but in fact, he's eating supplies that come from his own family's estate. So as David is leaving Jerusalem, he first gives all Jonathan's son's estates to Jonathan's son's servant. Then he gets to Bahurim, and a man of the family of House of Saul came out, cursing, murderer, scoundrel, The Lord has avenged on all of you the blood of the house of Saul. What he's probably referring to actually is this sacrifice that I talked about in 2 Samuel 21. That story, the last 4 chapters of the book of 2 Samuel look like they are out of place, and as if the material in them once stood earlier in the story. I think probably the curses that Shimei is yelling at David in 2 Samuel 16 refer to David handing over those descendants of the house of Saul. But this material at the end is out of place now, so it makes it confusing to know what he's referring to. On the bibliography, I have an article by Walter Brueggemann about the deconstructive appendices of 2 Samuel, where he talks about the effect it has to read the story as it stands without those 4 chapters and then get to those 4 chapters. Another thing that's in those 4 chapters is we get the name of the man who killed Goliath, and it's not David. And you just sort of blink and say, wait a minute, what's happened here in this story? So David responds very generously when Shimei curses him, telling his general not to kill the man. But my recollection is that when David returns to Jerusalem, he's not quite so generous.
Another opportunity for the folks who are in the Zoom room. If you have questions, either raise your hand or go ahead and ask one. All right, anybody here in this room, other questions?
I'm wondering how commonplace was it for someone to dance before the Ark of the Covenant?
We have no idea.
On that point, with Michal and her response to it, I know you were saying you don't believe that Michal was punished because of her criticism of David, but I kind of always felt that she was, not because she criticized the fact that a king would do that, because in him taking off the robes, he divested himself of that role. At that point, to me anyway, David seemed like the shepherd boy he was when he was tearing apart, lions and bears with his bare hands. It took him back to that place. But because that was an offering, and she criticized an offering, and the offering was holy. So is that a possibility?
That is absolutely a possibility. That is absolutely a possibility. And that is, in fact, how most people have read the story. The 2 things I want to argue is that that's not the only possibility. There are other offerings in the Bible that just because they are offerings doesn't make them approved of. And the other thing is, I think that given the history of Saul and his ecstatic behavior, and in his case, it's actually explicitly said, that it's because a spirit sent by God has taken him over. But it's clear, but it's not spoken of with approval in those stories. So the way you are reading it, absolutely and utterly and completely is a way to read it. And this is a good example of what Professor Alter also talked about, which is these are not like Aesop's fable stories where it's absolutely clear who has it right and who has it wrong. you can read it more than one way. And it remains so true in our own world. Usually what people do is sensible and good in their own eyes and in their way of understanding it. And if you see it through their eyes, yeah, it makes sense. And yet you see it through a different lens, and it doesn't look the same way. And we run into that again and again and again in these stories in Samuel.
I have a quick question. I was struck that Saul's son's name is Ishbaal. And so he has a theophoric name with Baal in it. Why would Saul's son have a Baal theophoric name?
The name Baal actually is not a proper name, but a title that means Lord or Master.
So it doesn't necessarily mean the Canaanite god Baal, right?
Right. So just as we are in the habit of referring to the Israelite God as Lord, but actually the name itself, JHWH, I mean, that God had a proper name that it has become custom not to say out loud. We use the title instead. But I think it's interesting. There are no accusations anywhere that Saul or any of his children worshiped foreign gods. There's a number of stories in which Saul is criticized for not worshiping Israel's God in the right way, that he makes sacrifices wrong, or that he goes into this prophetic frenzy, or that he asks for divination at the wrong time when he shouldn't be asking for it, or that he shows too much zeal when he kills the Gibeonites, or that he shows too much mercy when he doesn't kill the Amalekite king. But he's never accused of worshiping foreign gods. And so my hunch is that in that name, Baal simply means Lord, that Ishbosheth is man of the Lord, rather than man of what we think of as a Canaanite deity named Baal. But
another quick question. You did talk about how David gets his comeuppance with his concubines, right? That happens also with Adonijah, right? When Solomon is about to become king. Adonijah it is, right? Yeah. And doesn't he want to sleep with David's concubine as a sign of his kingship?
Either he wants, yes, that theme, that motif of sleeping with the king's concubine and what it would signify absolutely comes up in that story. The one thing we don't know is if Adonijah actually asked that or if Bathsheba invented the story. It's Bathsheba may be an innocent victim the first time we meet her in the story where David sends for her, but she has clearly become adept at court politics by the time we get into the beginning of Kings and Solomon. Bathsheba and Nathan are conspiring to get Solomon on the throne. But yes, that theme of the king's women absolutely comes up in that story, and it's reacted to the same way. The same way. You ask for the woman that my father slept with, that's treason.
Right.
I've always wondered about why Bathsheba was up there on her rooftop bathing in the first place. And being that close to the king's house and all of that.
I think my understanding is that was standard. The houses were not that big and they didn't have indoor plumbing. So the roof was where you did a lot of stuff. There's one other story about a woman who's seen bathing in the Bible, and that's in the Apocrypha. That's the story of Susannah. in the extended book of Daniel. And in Susannah, it is absolutely and explicitly clear that although the woman is bathing outdoors in the garden, that she is absolutely innocent, virtuous, and in the right, and it is the men who are perverse. So to us, I mean, we don't do that, and so it seems really weird. But I'm not sure it was seen that way at the time.
I have another quick question, if others don't. Gary Rendsburg has this wonderful essay called The Genesis of the Bible, which he makes a lot of claim about the monarchical origin of the book of Genesis, that Genesis is written during the monarchical period, and in some ways the stories there to justify some of the anomalies that happen that we see in Samuel. Can you comment on that at all?
Oh, I absolutely agree that there are tight connections between them. Absolutely. I'm less sure that it justifies the anomalies. I think in some ways Genesis snipes at David. And again, there's probably political propaganda in the books of Samuel, but I don't think that's actually the dominant genre. I think the writer is out to tell a really interesting story, and the book by David Gunn on the story of King David, genre and interpretation, is one I would refer you to on that. I read Genesis more as mulling over and reflecting on what happened, and in some cases, maybe twisting the knife a little. I am absolutely fascinated by the connections between the story of David's daughter Tamar and Jacob's daughter Tamar. No, it's not Jacob. Judah's daughter Tamar in Genesis 38. And I actually have wondered if the Tamar that we meet, I can't prove this is raw speculation, but if the Tamar that we meet in the books of Samuel, who's David's daughter, actually is the J voice, the Yahwist voice that we hear in Genesis. And that in telling that story about a man who has a series of sons, who all turn out badly, and none of whom do right by this woman, and she takes matters into her own hands to get the question of family relationships settled, is kind of a redemption by story, by Tamar of her own story. And if Tamar is not the storyteller in Genesis, she would, I feel pretty sure, have been in the audience to hear that story told. And the echoes between the stories would have been very, very obvious. And the notes in Alter's translation on the connection between them are awesome.
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, go ahead, Russ.
This was very interesting to me in a lot of ways, because it certainly wasn't what I learned about David in Sunday school. I'm wondering if you could in some way sum up for us what we might take from this story as looking at it as the fact that we are Jewish in many ways. What would I take from this story today that would give me a gem or a little core thing to take with me? And maybe it's just that we're all human and we forget the people in the Bible were human, but I don't know. Do you have any little thoughts on that you might want to share with us?
Well, let me give you one little thought. It's interesting that Jewish folk have continued to name their children Saul. Paul, you will recall, had the given name of Saul. So Saul doesn't have the horrible press in Judaism that he does in Christianity. And that may be in part because we identify Jesus with David. And therefore, the conflict between David and Saul makes Saul into a worse character than he might otherwise have been. I am fascinated by the fact that Mordecai and Esther in the book of Esther are from the clan of Kish, which is Saul's clan. So it's like way, way down the line there in the book of Esther. We get this courageous woman who in a sense redeems the story of the house of Saul. It is also interesting, and this is not about Saul's house directly, but if you track the stories of the priests in the beginning of 1 Samuel, it sounds like Eli's house is being just cast off forever and they've done everything wrong and God is totally never, ever again going to have anything to do with them. I think actually what's going on there is the story of how it came to be that they lost the right to be the priests who sacrificed at the altar at the temple and were displaced by the Zadok family that David appointed. But what's interesting is at the tail end of the story, as Solomon is doing his blood baths, he sends off the surviving member of Eli's family to exile in a little village called Anathoth. And if you go down the line to the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, you'll find out that Jeremiah was one of the priests of Anathoth. So again, a family that looks like it's totally cast off as we read the story in Samuel, shows up in a later biblical book as still active and still in relationship to God. So I like the point that you made about we're all human. And I think one of the things we might conclude is that when it looks like God has cast somebody off, we should perhaps be careful in reading more absoluteness into that than is actually there. Eli's, if Jeremiah really is Eli's descendant, if Esther really is a descendant of Saul, there is ongoing hope for the families. And in the Hebrew Bible, that's thought of in terms of family tradition going on, not just of the individual.
Any final question before we conclude? Well, Professor Steussy, we are so pleased that you joined us today. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we wish we could go on, but we do have to close now. But we want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you all. It was fun to go back and revisit this stuff.
Well, thank you again for being with us, and we hope our paths cross again.
Okay. God bless.
Okay, you
Stay
too.
cool.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.